A lot of preparedness content is about the serious stuff: food, water, light, heat, backups. Fair enough. But today I want to ask a slightly less dramatic question. Have you made any effort at all to make sure you can still do your hobbies when life gets awkward? This is not one of those "here are 10 hobbies for preppers" videos. That idea has been done to death. I mean the other way round. How do you make the hobbies you already love a bit more resilient? If money gets tight, the power's patchy, the internet's down, or life just turns into a slog for a while, it's not only your freezer and torch that come under pressure, it's also the stuff that keeps you sane. And I do think that's worth thinking about. Not because knitting is as important as insulin. Calm down, obviously not. But if a hobby helps you unwind, gives you a bit of routine, keeps your brain occupied, gets you through rough weeks, or simply gives you something that's yours, then it's sensible to ask one question: how fragile is it? So let's have a look. Have you stockpiled your yarn? You already know the truth. You're never really buying yarn for one project. You're buying this yarn because it's lovely, that yarn because it was reduced, and that other yarn because you're sure it will be perfect for something later, even though you've absolutely no idea what. And fair enough, I'm not here to judge the wool mountain. The question is very simple. Have you actually got enough of the boring essentials to keep doing it when the shops are shut, money's tight, or you just can't get what you need for a while? Have you got the yarn you actually use, not just the pretty oddments? Have you got the right needles, hooks, stuffing, thread, passons, whatever your version of this requires? This is not abstract. One missing bit can stop the whole thing dead. And once you notice that with knitting, you start noticing it elsewhere. A lot of hobbies quietly depend on consumables: paint, glue, batteries, flour, strings, paper, resin, coffee beans, clay, and all the other little things that get used up while you're busy enjoying yourself. You don't need a bunker full of it. You don't need to become the yarn dragon sitting on a mountain of merino. But if one missing item kills the hobby dead, it might be worth having that in a bit of depth. This is especially true for cheap consumables that are annoying rather than expensive, the kind of thing you never think about until the exact second you run out. If your hobby needs stuff, it probably needs a little buffer. Have you actually bought the book? You love your Kindle, and fair enough, that long list of ebooks took a while to build up. You've bought them one by one, picked away at recommendations, grabbed deals, built a little digital library, and made the whole thing part of how you read. If the power's out, the battery's flat, the app's logged you out, or the platform has a little wobble, what exactly have you got? Now, if you like ebooks, fine. I'm not here to start a holy war between paperbacks and screens. I'm just saying there is something faintly absurd about a hobby as old and basic as reading becoming dependent on charging cables and software behaving itself. It is worth asking whether you really own it in any solid sense. And once you notice that with books, you start noticing it elsewhere. Some hobbies can exist offline perfectly happily, yet people have drifted into depending on electricity, internet access, and digital platforms for no very good reason. That goes for maps, recipes, music, language study, sheet music, game manuals, reference books, downloaded tutorials, and all sorts of things people now access through glass rectangles. There's a quiet pleasure in knowing that if the Wi-Fi dies, your hobby does not die with it. Not every hobby needs to be fully analog, but it's no bad thing to own some part of it for real. Where's your tennis partner? You tell yourself you play tennis. It sounds like a proper hobby. Healthy, civilized, a sport even. But if one specific person stops turning up, you suddenly discover that you do not really play tennis at all. You have an arrangement with Karen, Mike, or Dave from work, and now Karen has a bad shoulder, Mike has 2 children, or Dave has discovered paddle and becomes unbearable. So what are you left with? A racket, some shoes, and a hobby that turns out to have been one cancelling WhatsApp message away from extinction. That's funny, but it's also revealing. Quite a few hobbies are like that. Board games, climbing, dance, co-op gaming, language exchange. Even some people's gym routine collapses because their mate stops going, and that was apparently the whole operating system. So it's worth asking, if this person vanished for a while, what happens to the hobby? Can you do a solo version? Can you widen your circle a bit? Can you teach someone else? Can you join a club instead of depending on just one loyal accomplice? You don't need to become emotionally detached from everyone around you like some sort of prepper monk. But if a hobby depends entirely on one other human, it's a bit more fragile than it looks. Can you still afford wargaming? You already know that your hobby has an astonishing ability to turn small purchases into a long financial campaign. It starts innocently enough. A starter set, a few paints, a few more paints, because apparently there are 17 legally distinct shades of brown. Then brushes, then basing materials, then a storage solution, then a better storage solution, then one more box because this one is for a completely different army, obviously. And before long, you're explaining to yourself that this is actually good value because each little tiny plastic man only costs a certain amount if you divide it over several years. That's funny, but it also points to something real. A lot of hobbies do not fail in some great national crisis. They fail in an expensive month. Something breaks, bills jump, work changes, a car needs sorting. Suddenly the hobby that looked perfectly sustainable turns out to require ideal conditions and a steady drip of disposable income. So the question becomes, does your hobby have a cheaper mode? Can you buy second-hand? Can you slow down? Can you use older kit? Can you enjoy the hobby with less constant spending? Can you reduce the drip, drip, drip of purchases without losing the whole thing? A resilient hobby does not have to be free. It just should not collapse the moment life becomes a little bit less comfortable. That's not only true of really expensive hobbies, by the way. Plenty of cheap hobbies can become weirdly costly because of habits, upgrades, subscriptions, and little impulse purchases. So yes, maybe think about that. What happens when Zwift goes dark? At one level, you're riding a bike in your house. At another level, you're apparently entering into a complex relationship with servers, monthly fees, firmware updates, Bluetooth pairing, and a company that may one day decide to rearrange everything for reasons of its own. If the app breaks, the company changes direction, the subscription goes up, or your connection's played up. Do you still have your hobby? Or do you have an oddly expensive clothes horse? That applies far beyond indoor cycling. Gaming can be like this. Learning apps can be like this. Smart exercise gear can be too. Some hobbies are now half pastime, half licensing agreement. Again, this is not me saying that the old ways were always better. Some digital tools are brilliant. I use them myself. But it's good to know whether you actually own your hobby or whether you're just renting access to it. If the cloud evaporated tomorrow, what would be left in your hands? Maybe plenty, maybe not much. So what do you do about it? Well, maybe keep one simpler fallback. One way of doing the hobby that does not depend on the full digital palace remaining intact. Maybe download things instead of assuming that they will always be there. Maybe keep local files, maybe have an offline mode, an older version, a paper version, a stripped back version that still works. The point is not to swear off technology and go and live in a hedge. It's to stop assuming that access is automatic. That's worth knowing. Can you mend your guitar string problem? You're ready to play, you want to play, the guitar's right there, and yet one snap string, one dead lead, one missing plectrum, one silly little failure can apparently bring Western civilization to a halt for the evening. Part of the hobby is not really just playing guitar. Part of it is making sure the guitar remains playable. That's funny, but also familiar. Part of having a resilient hobby is being able to maintain the means of doing it. Can you clean the kit? Can you patch the weak point? Can you replace the boring little part that always seems to fail at the worst possible moment? Can you do basic care without turning it into a grand project? This comes up everywhere. Instruments, boots, bicycles, sewing machines, camping gear, paintbrushes, controllers, head torches and cameras. All sorts of hobbies depend on little bits of maintenance that people put off until the moment the thing packs in. There's something satisfying about not being stopped by a problem that should never have had the power to stop you. You do not need to become a little workshop goblin, but a little repairability goes a long way. If you can't do the full hike, can you still walk? You had a proper walk in mind, not a token lap around the estate, a real one. Boots on, route chosen, a bit of weather, a bit of effort, maybe a hill if you're lucky. But life got in the way. Time's short, the weather's foul, you're tired, transport falls through. The day is not what you wanted. And that is the moment when a lot of people decide the hobby's cancelled. If you can't do the proper hike, you may as well do nothing and stay home. That's nonsense. One of the best ways to make a hobby more resilient is to have a reduced version that still scratches the itch. And once you see that in hiking, you see it everywhere. A full hike becomes a local weighted walk. A camping trip becomes a garden test. A big reading session becomes 20 minutes in the bath before bed. Language study becomes a quick cartoon in the target language. And a major craft session becomes just a little task. That way the hobby survives imperfect weeks. And honestly, that's probably a good principle for many things in life. So that's really the heart of it. If you care about a hobby, it's worth asking a few questions. Does it depend on consumables? Does it exist only online? Is it tied to one person? Can it survive a tighter month? Can you maintain the gear? And can you still do a smaller version when life gets messy? Because preparedness is not only about keeping the lights on, it's also about preserving bits of ordinary life when things are rough around the edges. And that includes the things you do for pleasure, for routine, for sanity. And sometimes just because they make you feel a little bit more like yourself. So yes, prep your food, prep your water, prep your lighting. But maybe also prep your hobbies a little. Otherwise, one day you may discover that the emergency was not that dramatic at all. You were just broke, offline, stressed and bored. If there's a hobby I didn't mention that would be fun to run through this little stress test, stick it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this sort of slightly odd resilience question, please subscribe. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to our next video.